Okay, it's my great privilege to welcome back Dr. William Struthers from Wheaton College in USA for the second of his two talks today. Dr. Struthers is an associate professor of psychology at Wheaton College. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses there in behavioral neuroscience and psychopharmacology, and he's also quite active in the research area of the neuronal mechanisms underlying behavioral arousal and the processing of novel environments. And he also speaks widely on this whole area of science and religion, and is particularly also involved in the area of neuroethics. So we're delighted he can come to speak to us this afternoon on the topic of the mind-body problem and theology. The consciousness and psychological and Christian perspectives. That was the other talk there. That's the confusion. Thank you very much. So,
yeah. A little bit of deja vu there, I think.
I was listening.
Well, I know this morning I promised that I would be hitting on some more interesting neurological matters today. Hopefully some of them will tie to some of the talks you heard yesterday, and we will be able to kind of continue this process. Once again, as a psychologist, you have to keep coming back to the realm of mind and behavior. And so when we are addressing this issue of consciousness, we do want to make sure that there are some clear issues here that we are addressing. I know one of the things that should be abundantly clear is that when you come from different disciplines, sometimes terms mean different things. And sometimes even, as was identified earlier, using different languages, whether it be English or German or French or whatever, these terms don't always translate as well as we might like. So when I am using the term consciousness as a psychologist, there are many different ways that you can describe it. Certainly philosophers will describe it different ways. But for the purposes of this short time together, what I would like to do is use David Chalmers' work and also to kind of hit this notion of consciousness as sort of a focal point or frame of reference from which we engage the world. So it's a unified thing, that we do experience the world, the majority of us, as a unified thing. You presumably have a visual signal that comes in that represents the blue and the white on the screen. You have a different visual cue that represents the blue of my shirt, and you have a different pattern, which is a two-dimensional pattern that is acting on each of your eyes. You're generating three-dimensionality. The sound of my voice is coming in, and you're connecting those visual cues with the voice. You're not assuming that the voice is coming from the screen as well. So this notion of this unity, that we see the world from a particular from a particular frame of reference and a unique perspective that is a singular thing rather than a fractured thing. Although this oftentimes you can look at much of the writing in psychology where they'll talk about fractured states of consciousness, individuals who have personality disorders or those who struggle with schizophrenia. This is something that comes up quite a bit. And as mentioned earlier in the talk from this morning, consciousness is very much sort of hand in hand. If it's not the mind-body question, then it is closely associated with the mind-body question. And so it does carry with it quite a bit of the ontological baggage that you have when you are dealing with this mind-body problem. So once again, the issues of monism and dualism have to be sort of brought back up again. What is consciousness? Is it that soul that was mentioned earlier? Is it something different? Is it an emergent pattern? Or is it some might want to argue it is one specific cognitive modality, that consciousness is really nothing more than attention, and that it does not include memory, that it does not include some of these, does not include sensation. It's just merely a more congealed form of attention. And many visual researchers will take that approach, many researchers in audition will take it as well. So consciousness is not the soul, but we do need to kind of think of it as a starting point here, as a unity. And that is how I will go, but knowing that there may be some of you that disagree with that. And of course, just to reiterate some of the theological matters as a Christian that we need to think of, is it that candidate for the Imago Dei that many people are concerned about? Is it a matter of substance? Do we think of consciousness as having a space? Or do we think about what is the function of consciousness? Or what is its relational capacity? If we think of consciousness as the self, and equate it with the notion of self, how that self engages in relationships with other individuals, and so on and so forth. So I won't bore you with any of that, but I would like to, however, push you down to the bottom here, because Christians should think that consciousness is important, and do, because it is tied to this imago Dei, to the soul, whatever it is you want to call it, because consciousness seems to be tied very closely with the notion of agency, that it is that we are conscious agents, that we intentionally are aware of the reasons why we do something. And this notion of agency is incredibly important for any kind of moral status that we might have. And if I could just sort of stop here for a second, the notion of moral status, that I as a conscious agent choose to do good or choose to do wrong, is critically important in the Christian tradition. If you do not have moral standing, you cannot have sin. And if you cannot have sin, then there's really no need for salvation. So the importance of consciousness as it is tied to moral agency is critically important, certainly within Christian theology on matters of soteriology, of salvation. So I do want to come back to that, because without the salvation that is found in Christ, in the Christian tradition, communion with God, being able to connect with God, is severely hampered. And if you don't have consciousness, you're not even sure what that means. So Christians should be aware of consciousness and should be interested in it. But of course there are other ways of thinking about consciousness. Now the misfortune that I have today is following two very articulate speakers who have hit on some of these topics already. So Dr. Clark and Dr. Combs have already touched on some of these, so I won't belabor them. The issue of the easy versus hard problems of consciousness, as elaborated on by David Chalmers, hits on these two primary questions. The easy problem, which we find out is really not that easy, is what are the neurological correlates of conscious experience, whether it be attention or how memory is pulled up, or take your pick of cognitive processes. That's the easy problem. If we do get all of these brain imaging issues sorted out, and we ask the so what questions, presumably we will be able to have a very nice little story to tell about what's going on in the brain when a person is awake versus when they are asleep. But interestingly, I think what we haven't really thought too much about is when we have neurological evidence of consciousness without memories of consciousness. And one area that we haven't touched on at all is what happens during sleep. Now, last night I was up rather late, possibly due to nerves, possibly due to jet lag, I'm not sure which, but I was awake and I couldn't get to sleep. And at some point during the night, a switch was turned off. And I sort of blinked my eyes and felt myself slide and woke up, and it was 5-6 hours later. Now, I have no conscious memory of what happened during those 5 or 6 hours. If you were to hook me up to an EEG and monitor my neurological processes, well, you would find that there were probably at least 3 or 4 times during that 5-hour period that you saw very similar neurological processes going on in my cortex. That there were, and I didn't get a chance to talk to Dr. Combs on his way out, if you can tell him that was the periaqueductal gray in that Pons and that Mary image. That's what that was. It's involved in pain signaling, which is, I think, fits very nicely with that. But during my sleep, there was a region in the Pons that would be spontaneously activated. And this would send a signal up to my lateral geniculate nucleus, which would then stream rearwardly into my visual cortex. And this is, we know, correlated with rapid eye movements and dreaming. So, I presumably have a modified version of consciousness while I'm asleep, but I have no memory of it. Now, if I were to wake up maybe 45 minutes later, I might have woken up in the middle of the dream, and I would have remembered the dream, but I would not have remembered the other REM bouts earlier in the night, when presumably the neurological echoes of consciousness, or the neurological substrates of consciousness, were in fact present. So this is one of those interesting issues that I think, even though we tend to give greater weight to the kind of consciousness that is associated with what appears to be wakeful behavior, there are other forms of what we might call, once again, I don't like using the term subconscious or unconscious, but I'm not quite sure what else to call it. There are other things going on that are important down underneath the cortex. So when we think about these easy problems, there are the surface level easy problems of what we would call wakeful consciousness, but there are other necessary things going on in the subcortical regions, down in the basal ganglia, down in the limbic system, deeper down into the midbrain, and even down into the mesencephalon that are critical for waking a person up and putting them to sleep. So it's not an easy question by any stretch of the imagination, but we have made significant progress in sort of understanding what's going on there. So it is easy in that we're seeing clear progress in this area. And then, of course, there's the hard problem. Why do we have any sort of sense of feeling at all? Now, I think that here we have to once again come back to the issue. If there's anything I'd like to do, it's return to the issues, which is certainly we have to deal with the ontological aspect of this problem, but secondly, we also need to get to what counts as data. And in the area of consciousness, what we'll find is that, well, this is, of course, going to hit on some of our old friends again, right? Issues of epistemology and scientific tenability. Consciousness is rooted in that sort of Kantian idea of I see something as I experience it versus the thing as it truly is, that phenomenon and the noumenon, right? That's right there when you are being forced to deal with these kinds of first-order questions about how can I know that any of you exist, which we talked about earlier in the day. So we have to have some sort of philosophical approach, epistemological approach to this. Generally speaking, if we are going to progress further, we do have that theory of mind, that I have the belief that you all have minds, and you have the belief that I have mine because we are similar in our shape, in our form, in our action, in our behavior, and so we go forward on that. The problem of other minds, obviously we've dealt with that. The issue of causal properties, epiphenomenalism, and solipsism, I won't review those, but hopefully you see that they are critical here. They're all critical because they do get to this question of what counts as data. We have what's called, David Chalmers calls first-person data, which is that subjective experience. McGinn writes, you can look into your mind until you burst and you will not discover neurons and synapses and all the rest. And you can stare at someone's brain from dawn till dusk and you will not perceive the consciousness that is so apparent to the person whose brain you are so rudely eyeballing. Whether you do this in gross form or in fMRI or PET or SPECT, I imagine the point is still the same. Now, this first-person data has been written on quite extensively by Daniel Dennett. He refers to it as qualia, and of course he is an epiphenomenalist. But I would like to step back and say that as a psychologist, I have a certain soft spot for first-person subjective experience data. I mean, if you look at the beginning of psychology as a discipline back in 1879, Wilhelm Wundt and the voluntarists and Edward Titchener and the structuralists, the methodology of introspection was critical to the beginning of the discipline of psychology as a legitimate science. So for me, I want to look at this and say, well, of course first-person data should count. We should take other people's words at face value, that the things that they tell us about what they are experiencing is in fact true. But that acts as one kind of data that we get indirectly and is probably better understood as third-person data, that we see it as it is reported by verbal behavior, or we see it as it is viewed in a brain scanner, or we see it as they change in their tapping of a button, whether or not the color red is present or not, or what the intensity of the light A has to be before it is identified as different from light B. So all of this is what we would say is third-person data. We certainly would include, I think, that sort of wakeful behavior that we see as well as third-person data, attention to stimuli, and these brain processes which are so incredibly attractive to those of us nowadays. I mean, I would say, in addition to putting brain scans up and them having a seductive power to convince people of things, I think you could probably say the same thing of a diagram like this as well. If you don't know anything about neural connections, or you don't know anything about acetylcholine or histamine receptors or orexin or GABA. All of this looks very, very complex, looks very, very impressive. And I think that the notion of developing these models and having multiple ways, not just brain scans, but looking at things at the circuit level, I think has a very, very much a power over us. And when we think of this collection of data, first-person data and third-person data, I think what I need to say is, as a psychologist, I want to argue that any account of consciousness should take first-person data seriously. It doesn't have to discard it completely, but it should certainly take it seriously. It doesn't have to give it primacy over third-person data, but it should take it seriously. Now, in this process, I would like to argue that functionality of first-person data has to be addressed. I think that there is sort of a, once again, I keep going back to that imago Dei thing with the substance, function, and relationship as well. I want to hit on that one more time here. The functionality of consciousness presumably has some benefit, has some purpose here, and it needs to be something that can also address how unconscious processes influence this subjective experience and the third-person data. Now, any scientific account, I think, must deal with the reality of the majority of neuroscientific data that's out there as well. So at the very least, consciousness has to have, and the processes involved in consciousness, have to have at least correlates that are minimal neural systems. So that if you have, for example, once again, the fMRI studies looking at religion, that presumably there is something there, that it's not something that is sort of hiding in the mist, so to speak, but that we do have at least some sort of neurological correlates to it. Secondly, it has to deal with external causal factors, and these external causal factors can be a variety of things. The variability of subjective states with experimental manipulations. If you're familiar with the field of positive psychology at all, you can induce moods in people. It's actually quite easy to do. If you can imagine a person who is taking a survey and you ask them to hold a pencil sort of underneath that front lip, they will have their face to droop as they're taking the survey out. If you design the survey in such a way after several minutes to have a mood self-report, you'll find that their mood will be significantly lower at that point than it would have been at the beginning with their baseline. However, if you put the pencil and have them hold it in their teeth where they're forced to smile, their mood will actually be elevated because of the facial expression. So I think it's really interesting that you can sort of induce these kinds of things behaviorally. Dr. Combs did his magic mushrooms, and certainly I think I hit on some of the pharmacological ways that we can alter consciousness, and people do this for recreational purposes. Certainly, they are also, I think there was an interesting question brought up at the end about whether or not you should slip someone a little bit of the magic mushroom. These types of substances are used in religious ceremonies in many different religions. So, I think there's a cultural issue there as well, that, the use of peyote in American Indian culture is considered to be a critical part of that religion. And to sort of say, well, we don't like that, so we want to say that that's an inappropriate thing to do. I think there's a certain amount of cultural bias that's brought into that conversation that we need to be very careful about. But recognize, certainly there are pharmacological substances, I'm sure that many of us will be consuming some later on this evening, that will sort of alter our conscious state. Hopefully not in too much.
Legal ones.
Legal ones. but legal is determined by the number of hands raised by those who are in power. And so, but I do think that we need to make sure that we're aware of these things as we're developing this theory of consciousness. Now, in this process, I think if we have these minimal neural systems, this data, we do need to have some guiding principles that systematize these neural systems with this first-person data. So we can't just be running off only dealing with the neurological things, or running off and only dealing with the first-person subjective experience, which is what has occurred, unfortunately, I think, within the discipline of psychology. Many cognitive and affective psychologists have sort of run off and they've developed these beautiful theories of emotion. but they do not map well onto the neurological models of emotion. Ekman and Plutchik have some rather eloquent emotional models that don't fit really at all with the emotional models that are being used by those in the neurosciences, who want to say, well, we've maybe got 4 primary emotions, and they're running around here with this 3-dimensional 16-level kind of model of emotion. We do need to have some way that we can connect these two together. These principles should be of increasing generality, and I would like to say that perhaps here is one of those opportunities where we can now slip supervenience or emergence or the notion of downward causality into the conversation. So, this third-person data, what is it about human brains? And I think that while earlier I mentioned the body is important, we don't want to denigrate the body. The brain does not exist separately from the body. I once had a philosopher ask me, well, if you can do the thought experiment and you had 2 individuals, individual A, and you took individual A's out and you took individual B's brains out and you swapped them, which one would be person A and which one would be person B? And I said, well, I think you'd have person C and D. I don't know if you would have the same individuals. I think it might be something very, very different. So this notion of human brains, certainly I think we would want to say that the brain has a privileged spot within the body, that it is the place that integrates all of the internal systems, it guides them, it directs them. It does seem to be the funnel point at which sensations are pulled together, the decision maker, and all of that. I don't want to deny that. But I do think that when you ask the person on the bus, what is it about human brains that makes them so interesting, the first thing that they will jump to is that old standby, the encephalization quotient. And there's many different versions of this. Some of it are the size of the brain relative to body, some of it cortex to the rest of the brain, and so on and so forth. But I would like to suggest that perhaps we need to jump on a bit beyond the encephalization quotient. That maybe it's not just about cortex size. Whales have significantly larger brains than humans do. And so if we think about some of these other items here, perhaps they might be at least good clues to what might be going on in the development of the unique type of human consciousness that we see. The first candidate that I want to hit on here is the cingulate cortex. Now, I find the cingulate cortex fascinating. And I know some people find it incredibly boring. Most people who do primate research and those who like looking in humans tend to ignore the cingulate cortex because it is tucked deep down underneath the larger folds of cortex. If you look at the development of the human cortex, it sort of starts and it bubbles out, so you get all of this extra cortical layers above the cortex, which gives us all of those wonderful wrinkles that seem to give us the beautiful gray matter of the human cortex. But as you move further down the phylogenetic ladder, what you find is that some species are lissencephalic. That is, they do not have wrinkles. They're nice and smooth. And if you've worked with many rodents, you've seen that rats and mice and hamsters have this sort of lissencephalic brain. Well, in these species, the most rudimentary sort of evolutionarily ancient form of cortex is the cingulate cortex. It's sort of the first type of cortex that you're going to see. And in the human being, as seen here, what you see is that the, let's see if I can slide over here, is that the cingulate cortex is unique for a couple of reasons. One is because it is that sort of ancient cortex, but also because of its circuitry. Because it is ancient, it seems to be wired into everything else in a very interesting fashion. Now, the cingulate cortex in humans extends from sort of the anterior pole here, actually all the way back into the parietal lobe. So it's tucked down underneath. Please remember, when you are looking at the brain and we talk about the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe and the occipital and temporal lobes, those are all terms of our convenience. We have arbitrary landmarks that we use. We use the central sulcus to differentiate between the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. Why? Because, well, it's kind of there. But we could very easily have many other ways of lobing up the brain, if you want to think of it that way. So the cingulate cortex is very interesting because it seems to run here from the frontal pole all the way back. What you find also is the cingulate cortex, when considered within the larger brain as well, has a position of what I would call kind of, that seat of the soul. Things seem to funnel into the cingulate cortex. And you have prefrontal regions projecting into it, so you're getting the more higher order cognition up here. You have sensory association cortex, which is where that sight, that sound, that tactile stimulation are sort of coming together, are also feeding into it. You see that the cingulate cortex has projections that are going out into the amygdala, out into the hippocampal formation. It's not shown here, but the cingulate cortex also has connections to the hypothalamus that are reciprocal as well. So it's tied into drives and emotional states. So the cingulate cortex is a very nice spot here. It sits sort of nestled in. And if we think of the brain as being an hourglass, with the cortex being up at the top and the deep brainstem down at the bottom, things seem to funnel down into it and then down further. So it seems to be a nice little bottleneck, which would make it, from a circuit standpoint, a wonderful spot to be looking for the sort of binding that we see in consciousness. Now, so the cingulate cortex, because of its connections here, it has sensory inputs, motor outputs. It's ideally situated to be a candidate for this binding center. What we do find is that the cingulate cortex does have, and there are many other pieces of evidence other than the brain imaging studies that suggest that it is significantly involved in guiding attention. Attention being one of those things that psychologists say is the hallmark of consciousness. We do know, however, that if you go looking for people who have cingulate lesions, they're hard to find because the cingulate cortex is bilateral, and it's hard, and because it runs the length of the sort of almost the corpus callosum, you're not going to find people who have tumors or degenerative diseases because it's deep underneath the cortex. You don't find a lot of these people. But you do find individuals who have epileptic seizures where the cingulate is part of the loci. It is very much tied to a rapid, immediate loss of consciousness. Oftentimes individuals who have epileptic loci, for example, in the temporal lobe will experience, those with temporal lobe epilepsy oftentimes will report experiences of, religious experiences, or they'll have a sense that it's coming and they'll have an elevated or altered state of consciousness. Not so the case with the cingulate cortex. When it fires and it shuts and sort of sends everything off, there's a loss of consciousness. Also, as I mentioned earlier here, with slow wave sleep and hypnosis and REM sleep, the cingulate is clearly something's going on here in the cingulate when this process is going on. The slow wave sleep, you see decreased cingulate activity, which is correlated with decreased dreaming, rapid eye movement. And when you have REM or attention-based tasks, what you do see is that this goes up. So the REM will increase in as much as when people are sort of woken up in the middle of the dream and they're engaging in some sort of goal where they're trying to chase after something. This has been speculated to be tied to the cingulate. We also know in looking at psychopathologies that individuals who struggle with addiction, individuals who have obsessive compulsive disorder, those who have attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, those who deal with intractable pain, all seem to have, depending on the nature of the disorder, the cingulate is involved in there. And there have been some very interesting studies on individuals who have intractable pain, where they actually went in and did cingulotomies. And they would go and they'd cut out pieces of the cingulate. And what they found is that these individuals were often reported to be, in the literature they're referred to as akinetic mutes, that the caretakers of these individuals, the phrase that kind of caught my attention was they said, it's almost as if his soul is gone. That he's sort of there, but he's not overly responsive to what's going on around him. So if you ask this individual who had the intractable pain, whether he hurts or not, he would say, oh, the pain's there, but I don't have any desire to do anything about it. It doesn't bother me. So this is tied to, very interestingly I think, if you look across the cingulate, the anterior regions seem to be very much tied to the issue of volition. The anterior cingulate seems to be where the planning of behaviors or the execution of behaviors are planned, whereas the posterior portion, once again, remembering that the cutoff for the anterior cingulate here, where's the anterior begin, where's the posterior, kind of start, those kinds of questions here. It seems as if the planning of behaviors occurs here and then moves rearwardly within the gyrus to the posterior portion, which then is going to send signals out to these motor regions. So we've got now sort of a new version of the pineal here, don't we? We've got sort of a planning region of one cortical gyrus, which is now sending projections rearwardly to execute and to act out that behavior. So the cingulate cortex is a really interesting spot for the initiation, motivation, goal direction of what I would call willful behaviors. Now, so what, right? So what do we do with this? Well, I think it's very interesting that animals with well-developed cingulate cortices seem to be animals that we are very willing to ascribe animal souls to. And animals that do not have cingulate cortices in their nervous system are those that we don't seem to want to be ascribing souls to. But that's just sort of an entry point. We've got some other things here to look at. So what about this cingulate cortex? What's interesting about it? Well, I've been fascinated that this discovery has gone untouched by the media. The discovery of spindle cells. Now, spindle cells are very interesting little cells. They're not first reported in 1999. They're actually first reported in, I believe, 1929. I think it is, by Constantine von Economo. And the spindle cells you find are these odd little cells that pop up, and they're named spindles because of their physical shape. And they pop up in human beings and a number of other great apes in the anterior cingulate cortex. It's been estimated that they appear approximately 15 to 20 million years ago. And when you look at the number of cells per section, what you find is that in orangutans, they're very rare. In gorillas, well, there's a few more in gorillas. There's significantly more in bonobos. Not as much in chimpanzees as we might expect. But in the number of cells per section, you find that humans clearly have the most abundant number of these types of cells. Now, these spindle cells are found not just in the anterior cingulate cortex, but they're also found in that frontoinsular cortex that Dr. Coles just mentioned to us about the experience of religion and social cognition as well. These frontoinsular cortical cells, these spindle cells, are believed to have popped up approximately 100,000 years ago. And I think that's rather interesting given the talk that was given yesterday by Kara, looking at, the anthropologist would say something happened. I can't remember, is she here? Something happened, it was somewhere between 10, I think, and 100,000 years ago that there was some neurophysiological change that occurred that allowed hominids, or these Homo sapiens, to start doing different things. And so, once again, to get the question, so what? Well, I think this is very interesting, that you have this in the frontoinsular cortex, you have these cells popping up. And the rules that govern how these cells have dendritic connections and how they have axonal projections, I think is rather interesting, and I don't think is a coincidence. I think there might be something to why these two things are found together. If you look at, once again, in not just the anterior cingulate, but that frontoinsular, these spindle cells, gorilla 16,000, bonobo 2,000, chimpanzee almost 2,000, human 82,000 of these cells now start popping up. This is a big deal. This is not something that should go unnoticed. And we do also know that there are other regions, the cells that were discovered by Constantine von Economo, which are named after him, and I think Allport actually refers to them as von Economo neurons before they adapted, or before they were given the name spindle cells. Actually, we see these in that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which was brought up, I think, during the question and answer period as well. Really interesting that those parts of the brain that seem to give humanity their unique sort of cognitive capacities seem to be very much related to where these spindle cells are. And the nature of these spindle cells, by the way, is not just a matter of number. It's not just that there are significantly more of these cells in these regions, but the volume of these cells is incredibly large. It's disproportionately large when compared to other species. So we've got some very interesting findings here with these spindle cells. And this is a study by Nijinsky in 1999, looking at, once again, the computer-generated maps of the localization of these cells in layer 4, the anterior cingulate in orangutan, gorilla, chimp, bonobo, and human. And you can see that the layering of it here in humans is in some ways an awful lot, like what you would see here in bonobo. But certainly, gorilla, chimpanzee, and what is it? Bonobo here. I'm sorry, that was I'm missing here. Orangutan. I'm sorry, orangutan, gorilla, chimpanzee, bonobo, and human. I find it very interesting that chimpanzees, which presumably are so close to us genetically, are missing this, and much of the difference possibly between our cognitive abilities might be due to some of these spindle cells. Once again, that's just speculation, but it's fun to speculate every so often. Now, what we do see is that you are able to find these cells, certainly, in great apes, but you're also able to find them in whales, bottlenose dolphins, and elephants. And I also find, the question, so what, right? I find it very curious that these are animals that Dr. Schloss talked about, the elephant, right, going around back to where its mother was. We look at the language of whales and we look at the social behavior of whales. I find it very interesting that you do have these correlates between these spindle cells and these types of what look like very advanced forms of social behavior and quite possibly social cognition as well. You do see that these spindle cells are not something that kind of pop up very early on. They actually develop postnatally. So in human infants, you don't see them popping up until around 3 years after birth. So it's almost as if the brain is sort of getting itself together, and part of the normal process of neurological development is the brain produces way more neurons than it possibly needs, and then it begins to prune them. It begins to go through this process of making its connections and then pruning the connections, and then those neurons that are not able to make good connections go through apoptosis and they die and they go away. And it seems that around this time is when these spindle cells start popping up. So these spindle cells have the potential to be significantly influenced by what's going on in the environment outside of the body in a way that's very different than you would expect the neurons that are developing in the spinal cord, or the mesencephalon, or the myelencephalon, or the mesencephalon, or even diencephalon sites. So it's very interesting that they pop up. And you do find as well that spindle cells do seem to be affected by individuals who have personality disorders, individuals who have borderline personality disorder. It's been argued, I think there's one paper that's looked at individuals who have autism, that they have a deficiency of these spindle cells as well. And we do know in Alzheimer's, I think the more interesting research is that in people who have Alzheimer's, you begin to see a very rapid degeneration of these spindle cells. As the dementia goes on, these spindle cells seem to be one of the first ones that go. So the notion that the dementia that you see in this sort of lack of awareness of what's going on around them could possibly be due to these spindle cells. Now, that's all fine, that's well and good. What about some other things as well? Well, if we look at what are referred to as mirror neurons, mirror neurons are a really interesting discovery. They have gotten quite good press. You may have heard of anyone heard of mirror neurons? Okay, good. Mirror neurons were discovered in monkeys back in '96, but to hear the story told, they were discovered in a lab in Italy, and what they had was they were doing single cell recordings in monkeys. So they had the monkey all set up in the chair, and They had a single cell electrode that had been implanted in the monkey, and what they were trying to do is monitor the motor behavior of the monkey. If they had a premotor cortex, they were trying to get the monkey to pick up, I think, a piece of food and eat it. And what they were looking for was when the premotor cell would fire relative to when the behavior would be enacted. And they couldn't get the monkey to pick up the food. So what happened is, the story is that one of the researchers went into the room, got in front of the monkey, and reached out and got the food, and the neuron went off. Well, what's a neuron in the premotor cortex doing going off to a sensory signal? It's the premotor cortex. It should only be firing when we're engaging in a behavior. And so this very quickly kind of took on the term the monkey see, monkey do neuron, that the process of engaging in a behavior, as you see a person engage in a behavior, that you have a vicarious neurological mirror of what it would be like for you to engage in that behavior that is activated. It's not necessarily engaged, but at least the sequence of behaviors is primed so that you could engage in that behavior should the need arise, whether there's an appropriate goal. And this whole notion of goal-directed behavior is tied there as well. But it's, once again, the question is, so what? Well, I think it's a rather interesting thing, because now what we have is we have an internal representation of someone in the environment. Right? We've now kind of addressing some of these theory of mind issues as well. Why do you think that I have a mind? Well, presumably it's because we have the same shape, and that as I move, you are moving along with me. As I'm watching something on the television, I am vicariously doing what I would do on the television. I wondered how many people were watching the World Cup and sort of kicking their legs, sort of wanting to kick, or when the ball would come, it would move back. Presumably as they are sort of mirroring what's going on during the football game. So these mirror neurons may be specialized for things like imitation, for observational learning, or aping, dare I say. So this notion of how does this fit with observational learning? How does it fit with how infants and juveniles learn what's appropriate behavior? You do see that this is the case in chimpanzees. The chimpanzees will watch their mother go and use that tool to fish for termites. And when the mother discards the tool, they'll go back and they'll kind of do the same thing. Right? You also see that this goes across species as well. And if we think of these mirror neurons as having some sort of level of cross-species, I have to kind of digress here for a moment, I'm sorry. There's a commercial in the States where there's a man who sort of walks in front of the cage of an orangutan, and he scratches his head, and the orangutan scratches his head. Right? And he waves to the guy who walks by, and the orangutan waves his head and walks by, and then his girlfriend comes by and he gives her a kiss, and the orangutan makes a kissy face. Apes are actually very good. Some species are very good at mimicking not just their own behaviors, but conspecifics, but other species as well. And I find this really fascinating. Not quite sure what to do with it. I'll probably turn that over to my anthropological friends. But when we look at these motor neurons, where are they? Well, they're, once again, we're going to find in the cortex, in some of the very same places that Dr. Coles just talked about. This premotor cortex, which is, of course, where they were discovered. The inferior frontal gyrus, which is, if you remember, sort of his brain image, that region tucked under there in the front, and in the inferior parietal lobe, kind of tucked there on the side, down by Broca's area. So, Broca's area, speech production. Interesting how facial expressions are learned, how language could potentially be learned by children as they see their parents moving their lips and moving their tongue. This is tied very much to this notion of how language could develop and how children will learn emotionality as well. That as they make facial expressions and as they see their parents make facial expressions, they respond to it appropriately. And if the train goes by and the mother has a fearful look on her face, the child will sort of make a fearful face and presumably learn to be afraid of the train as it goes by. But if the train goes by and the mother makes an excited face, well, the child will make an excited face and presumably will enjoy the train rather than be afraid of it. You can't really do anything anymore without addressing autism, and some have speculated that autism could potentially be due to where you fall along the spectrum of mirror neurons. And so that it's, perhaps autism isn't a category, it's an either or. We've moved away from thinking about that, I believe, to autism spectrum disorders. So that some forms of autism fall on the far end of the spectrum where there are virtually no mirror neurons, and others fall towards the higher end, so they're high-functioning autistics. Perhaps this is a matter of degree, a matter of number of cells, rather than an issue of kind. You're either autistic or you're not. And of course, one of the things that is sort of characteristic about autistic individuals is that many of them don't like to make eye contact, and they don't look at faces very well. And presumably that might be tied to these mirror neurons. Now, if we look at how these mirror neurons play out with some of the other developmental theories in psychology, what we find is that these mirror neurons actually do a very nice job of explaining some of the problems that Piaget had in his theory of how language developed. Piaget's theory really looked at the issue of mimicry, that you would actually need to see yourself mimicking the other person's behavior in order to develop some of these skills, but they're not necessary if you have these mirror neurons, that you have this imitation of others. And presumably these could be options for explaining lots of different things. I see we're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to move on here. We've really only talked about the brain. And what if I told you that we've really only been studying about 40% of the brain? We've really been sort of neurocentric. But there are a number of cells that help make up the brain. They actually outnumber neurons 3 to 2. So they end up being approximately 60% of the brain mass. These are the glial cells. Well, glial cells were thought to be kind of support cells. That they really are just kind of there to help the neurons. That the neurons are the really interesting characters in the conversation. And we really just have to spend our time studying neurons. Because neurons transmit information. They fire, they release neurotransmitters, they respond to electrical potentials, and that makes them different from glial cells, which are just kind of there hanging around, being fatty tissue to insulate the axons, or they're picking up the debris, like the garbage men, getting rid of the cellular waste. Well, what if we found that some of these glial cells could actually perform the same functions as neurons? That they could influence synaptic transmission, that they did release things into the synapse that potentially could alter synaptic function. Well, now we've got a problem. We've only been looking at 40% of the brain. Now we've got another 60%. So if we thought it was difficult with just 40%, well, now we've kind of opened Pandora's box here when we look at the brain. It might be significantly more complicated than we ever thought it was. And we thought it was pretty complicated to begin with. So now we have to start looking at other forms of astrocytic uniqueness. And what we do find is that in humans there are some very odd, very unusual cortical astrocytes. These astrocytes are disproportionate when compared across species in humans with other primates. That these astrocytes have significantly larger volumes, that their extensions and the manner in which they sort of wrap around and affect neurons is very, very different. Unlike things that we see in other neurons, they have ginormous, maybe that's not a proper English, a very large, I'm sorry, I work with a lot of teenagers back home, and so ginormous is the most popular term for really big. But they have these very large diameter cells. Their processes extend far beyond what you would expect to see in normal astrocytes. They layer themselves in the interlaminar fibers, and they have a unique form of polarization that you do not see in most other species. And that they tend to be linking kind of what's going on through the white matter with what's going on in the gray matter, the white matter being predominantly oligodendrocytes. And the argument that they are, in addition to the neurons, involved in synaptic modulation of cortical circuitry. So these astrocytes, and you have a picture here, Oh, sorry, I've forgotten the reference. I'll get that to you there. But this is just a picture of some of these astrocytes, looking at the issue of polarity, looking at the issue of where they fall, cell volume, and their extensions. You can see here is rather interesting and rather impressive. But I think I'd like to end here at this point by saying there's an awful lot more when thinking about consciousness than just thinking about how neurons play into things. There are issues of large-scale brain development. The cingulate cortex might be a very interesting place to start. We can not just approach it from that large macroscopic level of fMRI and PET scans and SPECT, but perhaps we also need to approach it from the bottom up as well. That perhaps some of these spindle cells or some of these mirror neurons or some of these astrocytic influences could be vital to get us to that explanation of consciousness that we need. Now, if I can just add one more item here. Consciousness, once again, it's not uniquely human. Right? We need to get over our sense of uniqueness. Right? But we do need to deal with the reality that religion does have a nice little spot here, and that consciousness holds a nice little kind of crown jewel of psychology there. And that we want to make sure that we maintain a commonality of humanity with creation. There is a sense of biological similarity, and to a certain extent theological similarity, with that unique human neurobiological information there. If we're dealing with the question of consciousness, what I would like to offer, and I would certainly want to solicit input on, is I like to think of this notion of consciousness and the approach is very analogous in psychology to what's going on in physics. Right? In physics, you have the first 2 years, where maybe it's different here. The first 2 years you teach Newtonian physics, and then the next 2 years you teach quantum mechanics. And much of what you learn in Newtonian physics complicates the way in which you can do quantum mechanics. And that, how do you bring together those two fields? That theory of everything, to put them together, is very much what we're seeing in psychology. That you have up here at the top this sort of higher order cognitive psychology that deals with first order experience and verbal feedback, and you've got tucked underneath it all of these neurological factors, all of these potentially glial factors as well. And that is what we are looking for in psychology, is that theory to bring those two things together so that they don't deny each other, but you've got that explanatory gap between them is brought together. That, I think, is what consciousness is. And as a psychologist, I'm quite excited about some of these bottom-up approaches. You heard a little bit earlier of some of the top-down, actually maybe from the middle-down approaches as well. But that is the conundrum for the psychologist. It is inherently the same type of problem that the physicists have in trying to resolve these two theories. So thank you very much for your time.
Very much, Bill. So, straight in.
Hi, Bill. Thanks. Great talk. Can I ask a very quick question?
Sure.
If you don't mind?
Ask them one at a time if you can, because I don't remember.
Right, okay. So the first question is, those species that also have spindle cells appear to be those animals that can recognize themselves in the mirror, and I'm wondering if you think there's a connection.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me. The animals that do have these kinds of spindle cells are, and I think also you'd make the argument for mirror neurons as well, that seems to be a little more than a coincidence to me. So I would say perhaps these are, at a reductionary level, perhaps part of the explanation for why you're getting these types of self-referential behavior, which of course would be tied to that notion of consciousness. So,
with mirror neurons, some have suggested that they are the basis for our capacity for empathy. Do you agree? You say they're almost certainly involved. I think they probably are.
So are mirror neurons the basis for empathy? I think that so much of human emotional communication occurs via facial expression, that it would seem to me that those individuals who are better able at picking up these visual facial cues, who have a greater number, we'll say, of mirror neurons, are probably better able to then sort of mirror the emotional state of the person that they're looking at, and to be able to make that sort of emotional connection to them. Now, some researchers have speculated that perhaps these mirror neurons differ across gender, that perhaps women, the majority of their mirror neurons are devoted more to facial expression, and which is why women might tend to be a little more empathetic, and men's motor neurons are much more whole body oriented, that they're much more kinesthetic in nature, which is why men tend to pick up athletic and sort of whole body behaviors much more rapidly and with a little more ease than women do. So I think that's it. Well, yeah, that's for me that once again seems to be a little more than a coincidence.
And just finally, Daniel Wigner has suggested that conscious will is an illusion because it comes from the confusion from the idea of the force of conscious will and the experience of conscious will, which can be distinguished. And I'm wondering what your thoughts might be.
That's a very interesting question. I think I struggle with the term will. I tend to be a person who thinks that organisms have impulses, they have goals, they have felt needs, and as the organism sort of kind of gets the lay of the land on what's going on externally and has an internal state as well, that what it does is it weighs options to get rid of the internal drive state, which, I think about drive theory, right? And there's an awful lot written about that. I did some of my doctoral training not just in neuroscience but also in behavioral psychology, looking at Holland Spence and that large, massive 16-item equation that presumably explains all behavior. And drive state is a critical one. If we think of will as not sort of choosing among options, but sort of satisfying needs or satisfying drives, then for me the problem kind of becomes a non-starter. That really everything that we do presumably satisfies some need or satisfies some drive. So it's not as if we are sitting off in a Cartesian sort of chair here pulling levers to get us what we want, but every behavior, every thought presumably is involved either in the generation of a drive or in the satisfaction of a drive. So if we think of consciousness as sort of going along that path, that's really part of consciousness's function, is to help us meet our drives. Then for me, the notion of will I don't find it to be that big of a problem. But so whether I think that I am in a Cartesian sense making a decision and forcing the body to do things is less of an issue for me because of that perspective. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I'll let you. We'll
Okay.
talk about it after.
Okay. Something.
Thanks so much. You've really opened my eyes to so many things, because I'm trying to write a piece of article on artificial intelligence and human consciousness. And your analysis had actually helped me to see some few things. Now, I could see that from here, you said most religions deal with consciousness in quotation.
Yes.
Right. Now, I want you to help me to expatiate more. What is maybe there is another definition, or is consciousness a matter of definition?
I think consciousness most certainly is a matter of definition, and most certainly different religions will deal with it differently. I think in the West, monotheistic religions, once again, it gets to that issue of language and what do we mean when we say consciousness. But I love that in the neurosciences, neuroscientists in the West are fascinated with Buddhism. They're fascinated with it. And if you really stop and you look at Buddhist thought, so much of it is about sort of losing your sense, kind of becoming one with the universe. And your sense of sort of losing that is a critical part in that religion, which is very different than what you would see in, for example, Christianity. So I put that in quotations because it deals with it in a very different way. And the notion of what consciousness is in Buddhism will be very different than what I, as a Western Christian psychologist, will think of as, and operationally define as consciousness.
In your view, do you think we can have some software system that can work on consciousness?
Can we have some sort of software system? Well, I'm not sure. I think that it's for me, I as a sort of a bottom-up thinker, I go to these spindle cells, and I go to these astrocytes, and I go to these, cortical gyri, and that's where I kind of want to look at. Are we kind of, once again, getting to that issue of emergence? How many spindle cells do you need before now you have a different type of wave function that can spread out across the cortex? That's a really interesting question. Is that a matter of software? I would think it might be more of a matter of hardware, but I do think that as you get better hardware, you can use better software. So maybe the Mac people will have something to say about that.
Peace, yes.
You say that consciousness is not uniquely human, so it means that animals have kind of different forms of consciousness.
Yes.
Can we say that in the extension of this point, can we say that animal has awareness of God?
So we have different types of consciousness. Animals have different types of consciousness. Do animals have a sense of God? I'm not sure. I think that it was very interesting what was brought up earlier about we're very confident that some of these other higher primates do not have the brain structures that are necessary for language. And certainly as a Protestant Christian, so much of the way that I think about God is tied up in language. It's tied up in the reading of Scripture. It's tied up in my theology. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So I think that I would be reticent to do that. I don't necessarily know that it is a threat to my theological positions if I'm kind of forced to go down that road too far. For me, the critical issue theological is that it's human beings that are made in the image of God. The notion of a soul, once again, that's not something that I find threatening. For me, the issue is the special revelation that human beings alone are made in the image of God, and we're not even sure what that means. Animals have consciousness. Human beings have different levels of consciousness. We have different levels of consciousness throughout our day. It's called the basic rest activity cycle. Every 45 minutes we go through a sort of a cortical cycle. Right? So some of you were asleep, and that's okay. It's not your fault. It's your body. That's the way your body cycles. And so our own states of consciousness can alter across the day. And I would like to argue that there are perhaps many different types of consciousness that human beings can experience. Do animals experience knowledge, or are they aware of God? I don't know about that.
Because from Islamic perspective, I don't know in theological level, but I'm gonna tell roughly. Every creature has God's sense, so they are all aware of God. So I don't know how can I link this point to the consciousness, but this may open a new area in the research area, doing this kind of research on animals, for example. But firstly, we should clarify this awareness, their animals' consciousness. There are lots of points needs to be clarified.
Oh, I definitely would think that there are many points that need to be clarified about sort of degrees of consciousness and varieties of consciousness. I do know that with respect to Christian theology, the issue of consciousness in animals seems to be, I think historically, a little less addressed than sort of thinking of them as souls. So when it comes to consciousness, it seems to be a much more recent term that certainly the scientific community has jumped on board with, and I think psychologists are perhaps the most guilty of using consciousness in a rather cavalier fashion. So what it means is going to be different depending on your school of psychology, and how that plays itself out with animals. Well, we don't even know how it plays out in humans, so that might be a little presumptuous of us.
Jennifer, and then we'll go to the back. Yes.
Okay, just one quick point. It was that there are some cases even in Scripture where God commands the animals to do something and they do it, like he tells the quail to go and give themselves to the Israelites, and so you get some sense that there's some ability of communication in that sense. But the question I have is about bonobos or bonobos, however you say it. They seem to have just about as many spindle cells as humans, according to your chart. Is that correct?
Well, that's just from that one figure.
Okay.
That one computer representation. When you look at the actual numbers themselves, they tend to be nowhere near as much.
But there's a lot more than chimpanzees. There was something that they had a lot more than. So my question is, do they show any behavioral characteristics that are different from chimpanzees and more like humans?
Boy, that I'm not sure of.
Okay.
I'm certain. I would be loath to say I knew the answer to that. I'm not sure if bonobos show more human-like behavior. than chimpanzees do. I just don't know the answer to that. But I do think it's kind of getting back to your point of that God sends the quails. I'm not sure that I want to say that the quails say, "Okay, God, we got you. We're going to go," which would be first order subjective data. Sorry?
Balaam's ass.
Balaam's ass. Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to go that far. Now we've got single examples there of Balaam, but does the quail acknowledge God in the same way that humans acknowledge God, or does he relate to them in the same way? I don't know if I want to go.
Well, I
down
wouldn't say
that
the same way, but it looks like it's not no way. It looks like
road.
there
Which
might
is
be
why I
some-
wouldn't want to
Right,
say no. Say just discard it entirely.
Right.
But I would say it's probably different, and it probably is tied to their neurological architecture, what their capacity for that relationship would look like.
How about the arms on this side? Are there any on the same point? This point that we're discussing? Yes. We'll go to Stephen at the back and then come forward. Is that okay? Yes. Yes.
My original question was going to be a different one, but if I can address this one very quickly, it's a remark really. The commanding sending language doesn't show anything about animal consciousness because it's applied also to wind. For example, God commands the wind, sends the wind. That's the only remark I've made.
Thank you.
I have another question, that could be later if you like.
Perhaps we'll stick on this topic.
Have there any studies been done on what genes are turned on in these spindle cells?
Oh, no, there haven't. And that's the beautiful thing about neurons is that they tend to, of the cells in the body, they tend to use the largest contingents of genes. In differentiated cells, they tend to turn more genes on and off during their life cycle than almost any other cell in the body. I've heard any number of different estimates, ranging between 40 and 75% of the genes that are part of the genome.
These are unique genes.
No, we don't know that. Those are many of those are just estimates. But when you step back and you look at, I think there's a naive assumption about genes that genes sort of are involved in building the system and then they turn off, and that's not the case. Genes are turned on and off in the life of any number of cells multiple times throughout that cell's life. And when you're dealing with neurons, the fact that you can take the magic mushroom and it affects you on into adulthood, to me, I listen to that and say, a gene was turned on. And some gene was turned on that radically altered the structure of that cell, whether it be in the number of receptors that it places, the number or the amount of neurotransmitter that it produces. Something happened there as a researcher, I want to say, at a genetic level that caused that neuron to change itself, whether it be externally with respect to synapses or internally with respect to some proteins that were produced or shut down for that matter. No, that's the beautiful thing that I think the genetic researchers are just sort of getting us started in that area. But in the area of gene expression that I work in, I work with proto-oncogenes, looking at the turning on of, for example, the gene CFOS turns on and produces a unique protein that can be used as a label for cells that become hyperactive for an extended period of time. So if you, for example, just walk across the room, that might not be sufficient stimulation, but if you walk back across the room 30 times, then a gene might turn on as a way of helping that neuron adapt to whatever's going on. And now the next time you're forced to walk back and forth, that gene doesn't turn on because the cell has been changed so that it can now accommodate and learn in response to what has been required of it. So yeah, but the gene stuff is really fascinating stuff. I really think it's interesting. But I don't know exactly what's going on in the spindle cells, and I'm not sure anyone does.
Okay, please. Yes.
On your slide where you were talking about the things that the cingulate cortex could be involved with, you had initiation of willful behavior.
Yes.
Is there empirical research backing?
Oh, certainly. Looking
That
at
would be
decision making, execution of behaviors. There's quite a bit of research that suggests that.
initiation of willful behavior is sort of free will type.
See, I don't want to use the term free will. I don't like that. That's why I prefer the initiation of willful behavior as opposed to the Center for Free Will or volition. So yeah, I just perhaps I'm being overly cautious about it because I do think that it's the use of the term free will for me is I'm very uncomfortable with it as a Christian because I think at one level, as a person of faith, I want to be a person who sort of loses my will. That my will actually becomes so conformed to the will of God that I lose the ability to choose to do that which lies outside of God's will. My lifetime goal is not to be at a place where I sort of, once again, hover around being free to do whatever I want and always doing it right, but to actually be freed up from some of these other distractions that prevent me from doing those things that God gives me to do. So, and that's why I think I'm just so very cautious about this notion of free will. I don't like it. I don't think that it's necessarily something that is, for me, is once again one of those core issues to my faith, which is why I like using the term, everyone has desires. Every organism has needs that they try to fulfill, and they engage in behaviors to try to meet those needs. So that's why I call them willful behaviors. And when it's time to go do the behavior, you initiate the willful behavior. So that's why I use that particular language.
Okay, I think we're here first.
I actually have two questions, if possible. If there is no, or if there is only a degree of difference between animals' consciousness and humans' consciousness, and humans' consciousness is, as you said, as you suggested, a specific form of this consciousness. Could you say that this consciousness is something more than an emergent property? Because it just there are a high percentage of cells or whatever else that is responsible for this in case of humans than in case of animals. Would you say that this specific form, which anyway is hard to define, I suppose, is only an emergent property of the material background which is there, or is something else?
Boy, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I would say that it is something else. But I don't know if the logical conclusions for saying that it is, sort of just an emergent property are all that theologically difficult to manage. I just think it's humanity has a unique form, and if we look at the unique nature of human brains, well, I think that's a fascinating thing to look at, and certainly, as a human being, would say that my conscious experience, whether it be emergent or some other form, is uniquely human. I don't know if I would want to go to the extent where I would say that. I got into a conversation with someone earlier. What happens if we find out that there's some other species that has an even more complex cortex than we do? Well, that's okay. Yeah, I thought that might be where you were going. What happens if the aliens do come down, and we do find that they have even more spindle cells? They've got quindle cells, and they've got 17 layers of cortex. Well, that's all fine and that's well and good, but they're not human. And for me as a Christian, I'm much more interested in humanity's place in God's creation, and the Christian theology deals with that particular part of the story. That's not the entire story. There are many other versions of the story, whether they're played out in cosmology or molecular genetics or whatever. That's all well and good, but and I think I kind of missed that conversation about the exoplanets and the aliens a little bit earlier in the week. But I'll just leave it at that. And the second question?
And I was, in a sense, I had a feeling that you equate the idea of states of consciousness with consciousness in morality issues.
Certainly. Oh, certainly.
Okay, and I was thinking, what can you say about, let me say about Kant's theory of morality. In Kant's theory, you should somehow represent yourself as a person of, let's say, a city of God, made by God or something. You should see all the other people like persons in this city, and you should react and act as they are parts of this environment. And this is kind of representation you have of yourself,
yes.
Which is, I was thinking if this can be possible for animals or something like that. It seems to me very hard, and it shows that it's a big gap between the two levels and the two domains.
Let me get back to, I think, the initial point where maybe I diverged and missed the mark in communicating what I was trying to. The fact that we have different states of consciousness, I don't think is something that is contentious. I think that we would also want to say that our moral status in those different places of consciousness varies as well. For example, I would want to say that as a person of faith, that the sins that I commit in my dreams while I'm sleeping somehow are a little different than the sins that I commit while I'm awake. And I think that's more what I was getting at. That the sins that I commit while I am under the influence of a drug are somehow a little different than the sins that I commit when I'm not. However, as I make willful decisions to use that drug and put myself at risk for those problems, well, now we're kind of moving the moral kind of slide, so to speak. That's, I think, more what I was going for with that comment. So I apologize if maybe I miscommunicated.
Okay, please, yes.
Forgive me, but of the three speakers today, I still haven't got a sense of what a thought is and how it maps on what we know of neuroscience. For example, I can't understand how we can, how big our brain is. It's unarguably a finite structure, and yet we can readily contemplate infinity,
Yes.
and we can even write mathematics, a transfinite mathematics.
Yes.
That seems to be incomprehensible, and I wonder if you can cast any light on it, or am I just being simplistic?
No. I think that the issue of what is a thought is certainly something that philosophers have a lot to say about. Certainly something theologians and psychologists have a lot to say about. What I do think is that we oftentimes run into a problem that we think that the brain is somehow this closed system, that it's finite, and that it's a very, very large number, but there's a finite number of possible connections. And what I think what we do is we lose the sight of the fact that the brain is not inherently a closed system. That because of the way that the human being is organized, the brain is actually an open system. And the entry point for those open inputs is through sensory perception, is through the senses. And not only through just sort of the base brute form of the senses, but through the nuances of how those senses, sounds can be sequenced together in such a way that they can now be processed, and we can have abstract thought or symbolic representations of things that do not have physical representation, do not have occupy physical space in this world. So for me, it's very much created as an open system that has a near infinite, that kind of deals with that need for the infinite capacity to think different thoughts, to have different types of experiences. And while you do have it has an open end to it, it also is sort of a self-propagating system as well. That even as you go to sleep tonight, and as you're sort of laying there with your eyes closed, that thoughts will be stringing one to another. And the way that you respond to one thought might dictate what the next one will be, and so on and so forth. And that will influence your body, and you'll stay up a little later because you're stressed out about something, or it will make it that much easier to get to sleep. So I think the problem that we have is we conceptualize the brain as a closed system when in fact it actually isn't.
Okay, there was another hand around. That's gone down there. Oh, well, Stephen's back in. You had your hand up first, and then we'll come to Stephen. Is that okay? Yes.
I just wanted to ask about mirror neurons. There are some people who would argue that they haven't been shown in humans.
Well, I think that there's, that's the problem with mirror neurons, is it's difficult to get someone to volunteer for a single cell electrode to be implanted in their head. Yet much of the data on mirror neurons is sort of second degree forms of data. I think it's probably just a matter of time before we start getting that kind of data back. Once we get a better understanding of where these cells are, what they look like in chimps and other higher primates, we will probably get a better idea of what the homologs are in humans, and we can start going in and looking for them. Now, we have clear ethical issues in doing this kind of research, but I had an interesting conversation with someone who is working with diffusion tensor imaging, and they were talking about theoretically. I think it's just a matter of technological practicality. I think that if we do get a chance to get to a place where we can have that kind of resolution, that's a pretty high level of resolution that you can have in a sort of an alive organism in a brain scanning device. You probably would see them. So I don't think that, for me, that's just a methodological barrier rather than one that I think is that they're not really there. So.
And the second question was, could all of these things be pointing to language? The bonobos, I think, most closely mirror language compared to the chimpanzees and the gorillas, and they seem to have the highest spin themselves. There's some people that posit mirror neurons for language. I don't quite agree with that. But could the cingulate cortex, maybe not language,
Well, I
but
think,
could these things map onto another unique human feature instead of consciousness?
well, that's the fun speculative part. Is that, and nothing if not someone who likes to speculate, as you probably heard for the last 2 hours. But I would step back and say, wow, that's the so what question. That's really interesting that you see very, very high levels of language in these very same animals that have very, very similar cingulate structures, very, very similar cortical structures, and these types of mirror neurons. You do see them there. For me, once again, it gets that seems to be a little more than a coincidence. And once again, I don't want to equate humanity. What it means to be a human being means you have to have this number of spindle cells. That I certainly wouldn't want to do. But I do think, my goodness, it's an excellent thing to at least be thinking about, and an excellent thing to at least be including in the conversation. It might not be the final answer, it probably isn't, but it's a wonderful thing to be including in that discussion.
Steve, you had a question?
Yes, thanks for letting me have this question. Earlier on, when you were asked about animals being conscious of God, you said you were agnostic on that point. Of course, animals is a very, very large term. Presumably the question I had in mind certain animals. But let me ask you this. Would you also be agnostic on this? One thing that's characteristic of human consciousness is self-consciousness, by which I mean here, I'm conscious of being conscious. Now, would you be agnostic also if I asked you, can animals be self-conscious? Is it conceivable that a tiger or an ant or a chimp, entirely different things, can say to themselves, or something like, I am a tiger, a chimp, or an ant?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm agnostic. I would probably be more in the camp where I would say it would not surprise me if they have a sense of self-consciousness. I would want to know what sort of data we're using as a way of inferring that they have that self-consciousness. But honestly, I think that the more interesting questions are kind of once again be a little anthropocentric. What about, for example, individuals who are born with anencephaly? People who are born anencephalic. Is it right to even call them people? Are they human beings? And I would certainly want to say to that a person who is anencephalic does not experience God or have consciousness in the way that I do. However, they do, and I think this is where you get into a whole host of biomedical ethics. What is my responsibility to that individual, to that organism? If you even want to, maybe you don't like calling them an individual, maybe you want to just call them an organism. I think that's a very interesting question that certainly as a neuroscientist, I need to start kind of grappling with some of these issues. If you know that your child is going to be born with anencephaly, is it a mortal sin to abort it? Those are some interesting questions, I think, that play themselves out in the practicality of real life.
I think it's a different question, if I may say so.
It is.
From whether it is a child. Whether we should abort is a different question from the child. Because I think we are in danger here of defining everything in terms of the human subjects.
Yes.
Really, it's what God thinks of us and Catholic children and tigers. That is what defines our identity, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
I think you agree with that.
I think that there are two things tied to it. I think certainly we are very much anthropocentric about it, but I think it's also we're very neuroessentialist about it as well. We do tend to give the brain, and I think the case of the anencephalic is a perfect example of that. Most people that I talk to, when I mention who understand what anencephaly is, they're perfectly fine saying, well, it's not really a person. They don't really know what's going on. But it gives that brain that sort of privileged point. But you see that many individuals will actually, I have a student actually who had a child who was anencephalic, who going to continue to care for that child until such a point in time when either their body just shuts down or whatever, because they see it as their as a moral call for them to continue to care for that child. Is it a child? Wow, and kind of getting at these issues, especially of spindle cells, infants don't have spindle cells. You know, if they're that important, and then you don't want to go the Peter Singer route, right? Of looking at an infant. I mean, now we got a whole different set of problems here. But I just think that's so exciting and so many interesting conversations to have. I should probably stop before I get carried.
Well, I was just going to press you slightly on your tiger, just briefly on your tiger, because it seems to me, I mean, your tiger, having self-awareness that I am a tiger, needs sort of language, I guess. I mean, isn't consciousness very linked to language, in the sense that tigerness, you need a concept of tigerness and sort of tiger language to know that I'm a tiger, isn't that part of it?
See, I'm not sure that language is sufficient. I think it's probably necessary for some forms of consciousness. For example, I think that there are times when I am conscious, but I'm not processing linguistically.
Well, I'm not talking about humanity, I'm talking about tigers.
Oh,
yes,
but I think that what I'm trying to do is say that language, if we give language a privileged spot for consciousness, I can imagine as a human being a time when I'm fully conscious, but not exercising the capacity for language. And so if I can imagine that in humans, I think it would be a little presumptuous for me to say that other animals don't have that form of consciousness, those who do not have capacity for language.
Well, I'm sure we're going to return to a number of these questions on the panel tonight. And I think probably we should draw stumps there. We really have worked very hard indeed with these 2 talks and 2 half an hours of questions. So thanks very much.